Hi guys, and welcome to Relaxation Bedtime History. Tonight we step into Westminster before sunrise, when the Thames is still dark, the lamps along the river tremble in the mist, and the old palace of Westminster looks less like the famous seat of government you know today, and more like a huge, slightly exhausted collection of stone, timber, chimneys, courtyards, and passages that has somehow accumulated over centuries. You hear cartwheels grinding over uneven ground, smell coal smoke mixing with river mud, and feel the cold dampness settling into your coat. And just to be clear, if you arrived here expecting modern security, clear signage, central heating, and a helpful map saying you are here, you probably won't survive this place with your dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and follow the river northward toward Westminster. It is still early enough that London has not fully awakened. The city seems to breathe in low, smoky sighs across the water. Small boats move like shadows, oars dip quietly into the Thames, and every stroke sends a soft slap against the black surface. Somewhere behind you a horse snorts, harness buckles knock together, and a sleepy driver mutters at an animal that clearly has stronger opinions about working before breakfast than Parliament does. Ahead stands the palace. Do not picture the great Gothic building that dominates modern photographs of London. That structure belongs to the future. The palace before you in the early 19th century is older, stranger, and much less unified. Parts of it are medieval. Others have been rebuilt, altered, enlarged, narrowed, repaired, subdivided, or awkwardly attached to something else. Roof lines rise at different heights. Chimneys sprout almost wherever they please. Windows vary in size and style. This is not architecture arranged around a single grand plan. It is history that has forgotten to tidy up after itself. The Palace of Westminster began as a royal residence many centuries before your visit. Anglo-Saxon kings used the site, and Norman rulers expanded it. Westminster Hall, completed at the end of the 11th century under William II, still dominates part of the complex and remains one of the great surviving spaces of medieval England. That is one of the firm anchors in this otherwise bewildering landscape. Westminster Hall has stood here since 1099, although its famous hammer beam roof came later. Its stone walls have watched royal ceremonies, law courts, state trials, merchants, lawyers, petitioners, and generations of people hurrying through with somewhere important to be. You're not yet going inside. For now, you remain outside, where the palace makes its first impression through confusion. There are yards, gateways, side entrances, doors for officials, routes used by servants, approaches connected with courts, and passages that seem to exist largely because somebody once needed to get from one old building to another without knocking either of them down. Old Palace Yard opens beside the complex, while New Palace Yard lies toward the north. Their names are wonderfully misleading to a modern ear because both are ancient by your standards. Westminster has been calling things old and new for so many centuries that the words have almost become jokes. A small historical oddity hides in that naming. New Palace Yard was associated with the newer parts of the medieval royal palace, centuries before the 19th century, so by the time you arrive, the word new has been doing rather heroic work for a very long time. You pass men beginning their day near the entrances. A messenger carries papers tucked safely beneath his arm. A servant crosses a yard with the purposeful expression of someone who knows exactly which door matters. A clerk walks quickly enough to suggest that being late is already becoming a problem. Another man pauses to exchange a few words beneath an archway. To you, the palace feels historical. To them, It is a workplace. Royal life had largely departed after a destructive fire in 1512 damaged the residential palace, and Henry VIII shifted his principal London residence to nearby Whitehall. Yet Westminster did not become useless. Instead, its rooms increasingly served courts, government offices, and Parliament. The transformation was gradual rather than neat. A chapel becomes a debating chamber. A royal room becomes administrative space. A passage designed for one purpose becomes the route to something entirely different. This helps explain why the palace feels like a political organism rather than a carefully designed government building. Parliament has grown inside spaces that were never originally intended to accommodate the modern institution now using them. Scholars continue to debate exactly how some of the earlier rooms and routes changed function across the centuries. Because rebuilding, lost structures, incomplete records, and repeated alterations make portions of the old palace difficult to reconstruct with complete certainty. The river mist begins to thin, more windows brighten, footsteps multiply across the stones. A bell sounds somewhere beyond the walls, followed by another noise you cannot quite identify. Doors open, voices carry through archways. The sleeping palace is becoming a working one. You move closer and notice how little ceremony accompanies the beginning of the day. Government does not awaken with trumpets. It wakes with keys, papers, coal, ink, boots, complaints, errands, and people trying to remember where they left something yesterday. And as you cross toward the entrance, the palace seems to swallow you almost casually. The air changes first. Outside, you had the river and cold morning wind. Inside, you meet stone, dust, faint smoke, old timber, damp fabric, and the accumulated smell of a building that has been occupied for longer than anyone around you can really imagine. A narrow way leads onward, then another turns away from it. A staircase disappears upward. A darker passage slips beneath an arch. You have entered the political heart of Britain, although it feels suspiciously like someone has handed government to a medieval maze, and deeper inside. Beyond these first confusing turns, the palace is waiting to show you just how many centuries can fit beneath one roof. The passage narrows as you move deeper into the palace, and almost immediately you begin to understand that Westminster has not really been designed so much as accumulated. The floor beneath your feet changes level without apology. 3 steps rise where you do not expect them. A corridor bends around a wall that clearly predates the corridor itself. One doorway seems grand enough for a bishop, while the next requires you to duck slightly unless you enjoy introducing your forehead to medieval masonry. Nothing matches. That is the point. You're walking through centuries stacked beside one another. The oldest surviving sections of Westminster carry the weight of the Middle Ages, but later rulers, officials, architects, clerks, and committees have continued adding, dividing, repairing, and adapting whatever space happens to be available. Instead of sweeping away the past, they usually build around it, so the palace grows sideways and upward, and occasionally into shapes that make you wonder whether anyone involved owned a ruler. You pass through a small courtyard enclosed by irregular walls. High windows catch the weak morning light. Timber projections lean slightly over passages below. Chimneys rise at unexpected angles, somewhere above. A casement opens and somebody shakes dust from a cloth with the confidence of a person who assumes gravity will deal with the rest. You step aside, a sensible decision. The air is cool here, trapped between stone walls that see little direct sunlight. Dampness clings to corners, moss darkens the base of masonry, and the smell of yesterday's rain remains in cracks beneath your shoes. Above you, roofs overlap in layers. Some are tiled, some have been repaired repeatedly. Lead covers certain sections. while gutters and drains follow routes that appear to have been negotiated rather than planned. This strange architectural patchwork is one of the most important things to understand about the old palace. By the early 19th century, Parliament occupies a complex that has evolved over hundreds of years. Buildings once intended for royal ceremonies now sit beside courtrooms, administrative offices, residential apartments, service areas, committee rooms, staircases, stores, and spaces whose functions have changed so many times that even experienced occupants may describe them differently. A modern Parliament building would probably begin with a blueprint. Westminster begins with history and then tries to squeeze desks into it. You turn beneath another archway and emerge into a broader passage. The walls here look older than the fittings around them. Wooden doors have been installed within stone openings. Iron hooks support lamps. Notices and instructions appear near entrances. Clerks pass carrying bundles of paper, leaving faint trails of dust and sealing wax fragrance behind them. One man knows exactly where he's going. You do not. He disappears through a door before you can politely pretend that following him was intentional. A major historical fact explains much of this architectural confusion. The medieval Palace of Westminster had once been one of the principal royal residences of England, but the fire of 1512 badly damaged the private royal quarters. Henry VIII eventually moved his London court primarily to Whitehall Palace, leaving Westminster increasingly available for Parliament, law courts, and government business. Yet the old royal buildings were never simply converted through one organised renovation. They were reused. A former royal chamber might receive partitions, a chapel might acquire benches, a storage room might become an office, a ceremonial route might slowly transform into an everyday shortcut for clerks carrying documents. You pass one such doorway and imagine generations of footsteps smoothing the threshold. The buildings almost seem to remember each function: courtier, lawyer, servant, member of parliament, messenger. Then perhaps a man carrying coal who has no interest whatsoever in constitutional development and would simply like everyone to stop blocking the stairs. The palace is full of these collisions between grandeur and practicality. You find yourself beside a wall containing traces of an older opening that has been blocked. Its outline remains visible beneath later work. A ghost doorway leading nowhere. That kind of feature is common in buildings repeatedly altered over centuries. Old arches are sealed, new openings are cut, rooms are divided, combined, and divided again. Westminster becomes an architectural palimpsest, though you need not use such a scholarly word while trying not to trip over the threshold. A particularly curious detail is that some people working in the old palace could spend years using certain routes without fully understanding what lay behind neighbouring walls. The complex had acquired hidden stairs, forgotten recesses, tiny rooms, and service passages created during different phases of alteration. Stories later circulated about secret ways through Westminster. Some were exaggerated, naturally. Old buildings are very good at producing legends. Give Londoners a dark staircase and 300 years, and somebody will eventually insist that a conspirator, ghost, monarch, or mysterious monk once used it. Yet there really were obscure passages and chambers. The gunpowder plot of 1605, for example, has permanently attached the idea of hidden spaces to Westminster. Guy Fawkes was discovered guarding barrels of gunpowder in an undercroft beneath the House of Lords. By your 19th century visit, that event is already more than 2 centuries old, but its memory still hangs over parliamentary tradition. Historians remain divided over the precise configuration and uses of several vanished parts of the pre-fire palace, especially because the destruction of 1834 would later erase structures that surviving plans and descriptions record imperfectly. You, fortunately, are walking through them before that happens. For now, the confusing rooms are very much alive. You hear a door slam somewhere behind you. A burst of laughter comes from an upper floor. Someone calls a name across a courtyard. A porter answers. Coal is being carried toward a fireplace. Papers are being moved between offices. A servant balances a tray carefully along a passage where the floor slopes just enough to make the journey more interesting than anyone needs before breakfast. You continue forward and encounter another courtyard. This one feels almost enclosed from the sky. Laundry or cloth hangs near an upper window. Smoke leaks lazily from several chimney pots. A wooden gallery crosses part of the space, connecting rooms that appear as though they were never meant to communicate with one another. Here the palace feels less like a national monument and more like a crowded neighbourhood compressed into government property. People work here. Some even live within or near parts of the complex. Officials occupy apartments, keepers oversee rooms, servants move between domestic and institutional spaces. The boundaries between palace, courthouse, office, and home can become surprisingly blurry. You brush your hand against a cold stone wall. It feels solid, permanent, and yet almost everything around it has changed repeatedly. Kings have gone, walls have shifted, rooms have changed names, doors have appeared and disappeared. Still, the ancient structure continues absorbing new purposes. Perhaps that is the strangest quality of Westminster before the fire. It looks fragile and improvised, but it has survived by adapting. Every generation complains about its inconvenience. Then every generation adds something else. You climb another short staircase. The steps are worn slightly lower in the middle. At the top, a draught carries the smell of smoke, old wood, parchment, damp wool, and something warmer from a nearby kitchen. You turn toward a brighter opening. Beyond it waits a space unlike these cramped passages. Suddenly the ceiling will rise, the walls will spread outward, and the palace's tangled little corridors will deliver you into one of the largest and oldest rooms in Britain. Westminster Hall is beginning to wake. The change in scale is immediate. You step out of the palace's cramped passages and into Westminster Hall, and for a moment the building seems to breathe outward around you. The ceiling rises far above your head. The walls stretch away. Morning light filters through high windows and falls across a floor already beginning to fill with movement. After the tight staircases and crooked corridors behind you, the hall feels almost impossible in its size, as though someone has taken the entire tangled palace and suddenly opened a great stone lung in the middle of it. Your footsteps sound different here. They echo. So do everyone else's. Boots strike the floor, voices bounce from wall to wall, a porter calls to someone across the hall, papers rustle, a lawyer coughs. Somewhere nearby, a wooden bench scrapes sharply enough to make several people glance around in irritation, and above all of it hangs the roof. You look up. The enormous hammer beam structure seems to float in the dim height. Dark timbers crossing and rising with a complexity that feels almost decorative, until you remember that it's holding an enormous roof above your head. The hall itself dates back to the reign of William II and was completed in 1099. Its famous timber roof, however, belongs largely to the late 14th century, when Richard II ordered a major reconstruction. By the time you stand beneath it in the early 19th century, people have been gathering here for more than 700 years. That is difficult to absorb. You're not simply inside an old room, you're inside a room that has outlived dynasties. Kings have held feasts here, state ceremonies have unfolded here, trials of enormous political importance have taken place beneath this roof. Monarchs, nobles, judges, prisoners, lawyers, servants, merchants, and curious spectators have all crossed this floor. Yet on an ordinary working morning, Westminster Hall is not behaving like a shrine. It is behaving like a busy public building. Men move in several directions at once. Lawyers gather in small clusters, their clothing immediately marking them as members of a profession that has somehow decided serious thought becomes more convincing when accompanied by elaborate wigs. You pass one barrister adjusting papers while another speaks quietly beside him. Their voices are controlled, but the speed of their conversation suggests urgency nearby. A clerk carries a bundle tied with string. A petitioner waits uneasily near a doorway. A messenger hurries across the floor with the particular expression of someone who has been told that something is extremely important and has not been given enough time to deliver it. The hall has long been closely connected with English law. By your period, several major law courts operate in or around Westminster Hall. The Court of King's Bench, the Court of Common Pleas, and the Court of Chancery all have strong associations with this complex, turning the palace into a centre not only of legislation but of litigation. That means many people arriving here are not MPs. They are lawyers, clients, witnesses, officials, people involved in disputes over property, debts, inheritance, contracts, rights, and all the ordinary complications created whenever human beings own things and disagree about who should control them. You continue slowly. The smell of the hall is difficult to separate into neat parts. There is damp stone, wool coats, leather, paper, ink, mud brought in from outside, smoke drifting from nearby fires, and underneath it all, the faint human warmth of a crowd gathering indoors on a cool morning. Westminster Hall can also feel surprisingly commercial, historically. Small shops and stalls had operated within or around the hall, selling books, stationery, legal materials, and other goods by the 19th century. Some of these older commercial patterns have changed, but the memory of the hall as a place where law, politics, trade, and everyday business overlap has never completely disappeared. One wonderfully odd feature of earlier Westminster life was the presence of booksellers and other traders so close to some of the kingdom's most solemn legal proceedings. Imagine losing a lawsuit and then immediately having the opportunity to purchase stationery. Efficient, if emotionally ambitious. You move toward one side of the hall. The space grows louder. A group of attorneys has formed around a table. One man reads quickly while another points to a line in a document. Their clothing is formal, but their body language is ordinary. One shifts his weight impatiently. Another rubs his eyes. A third seems to have mastered the ancient professional skill of appearing interested while thinking about lunch. You almost smile. Institutions can be grand. People remain people. A nervous client stands a short distance away, waiting for instructions. Perhaps his dispute concerns land, perhaps money, perhaps a will. You cannot know. What you do know is that this hall has consequences for lives far beyond Westminster. Decisions made in these rooms can determine who owns a house, who receives an inheritance, who pays a debt, who keeps an office, or whether a legal claim survives. For all its ancient timber and ceremonial history, Westminster Hall is therefore deeply connected to ordinary anxiety. Someone somewhere has slept badly because of what will happen here today. You pass beneath another beam of pale light. Dust hangs in it. The particles move slowly, almost peacefully, completely indifferent to the arguments below. Architectural historians still disagree over aspects of how Westminster Hall's surrounding legal spaces were arranged and modified during different periods, especially where temporary fittings, partitions, and later alterations changed the way people moved through the building. That uncertainty seems appropriate. Westminster rarely offers a simple answer when three complicated ones will do. A court official crosses ahead of you. You follow at a respectful distance and hear the soundscape changing again. The general murmur of the hall begins to divide into more focused voices coming from adjoining court spaces. Someone is speaking formally. Another person interrupts. A clerk reads from a document. The language becomes more careful, more expensive sounding. A lawyer passes close enough that you catch the smell of powder from his wig and damp wool from his coat. You resist the urge to sneeze. Very dignified. The great hall behind you continues filling. More people enter through the doors. Outside, London is now properly awake, and the palace has begun its full daily rhythm. Yet Westminster Hall remains the great crossroads. Members of Parliament may pass through. Judges and lawyers pass through. Petitioners pass through. Servants and messengers pass through. People carrying national questions and people carrying very personal ones briefly occupy the same ancient space. And that may be the most remarkable thing about the hall. It is monumental without being distant. History does not sit quietly behind a rope here. It walks past you carrying documents. You turn toward the legal chambers, where the grand echo of Westminster Hall begins to fade behind thicker walls. Ahead, arguments are already underway, paper is accumulating, fees are being calculated, and somewhere inside this ancient palace, someone is about to discover that English law can be almost as confusing as the corridors that brought you here. The voices ahead become sharper as you leave the broad openness of Westminster Hall and enter the world of courts, petitions, fees, copied documents, and careful argument. The atmosphere changes almost at once. Here, space feels tighter. Doors open and close frequently. Clerks carry papers from one room to another. Lawyers stand in small groups speaking in low voices, while clients hover nearby with the strained patience of people who know that every additional hour may cost them money. You move along the edge of a courtroom and find a place where you can watch without getting in anyone's way. That, already, is an achievement. The legal world of Westminster is crowded. By the early 19th century, the palace remains closely associated with several of England's most important courts. Their procedures have developed across centuries, producing layers of precedent, custom, paperwork, and specialized language to those who work here every day. Much of it is familiar to you. It can feel like entering a conversation that began 300 years ago and nobody thought to summarize. A clerk stands before a desk, reading from a document. His voice is steady. Nearby, another man scratches notes with a pen. Ink glistens briefly before soaking into the paper. Sand may be sprinkled to help dry the writing, and sheets are folded, tied, stacked, copied, carried, and filed. Paper seems to reproduce whenever nobody's looking. You begin to understand that law here is not only spoken, it is manufactured physically. Every petition must exist somewhere. Every claim must be recorded. Every order must be copied. Every judgment generates more writing. The result is an ecosystem of documents. Bundles sit on desks. Rolled papers occupy shelves. Clerks move with armfuls of material that look dangerously capable of becoming a small landslide. One well-established feature of English legal administration in this period is its dependence on professional clerks and copyists, long before typewriters or electronic records. Much of the machinery of justice depends on handwriting that is accurate, legible, and produced in considerable volume. A missed word can matter, a wrong name can matter, a date can matter. You suddenly feel much more sympathetic toward the man bent over a page beside the window. His fingers are stained with ink. He pauses, flexes them once, then resumes writing. There is no dramatic music. No judge pounds a table. Most of law looks like this: waiting, reading, writing, checking, then waiting again. A barrister rises nearby. His wig catches your attention before his argument does. It is difficult not to stare. The powdered legal wig is already an old custom by your period, inherited from fashions that spread through elite society in the 17th century. By the 19th century, most ordinary men no longer wear such wigs in daily life. Yet the legal profession retains them as a mark of office and tradition. So there you are, standing in a building where medieval walls surround Georgian paperwork while men wear a hairstyle from another century. Westminster has once again refused to choose a single historical period. The barrister begins speaking. His tone is controlled rather than theatrical. He refers to documents. Another lawyer responds. A judge listens. From where you stand. The dispute sounds dense, but beneath the legal vocabulary lies something painfully ordinary. Money, property, obligation, human beings disagreeing. That part has not changed much. Outside this room, a solicitor speaks quietly with a client whose expression has become increasingly worried. The client nods several times, though not with the confidence of a man who fully likes what he is hearing. Perhaps another fee has appeared. Legal expenses in this period can be formidable. A case may involve charges for drafting, copying, filing, attendance, consultation, and other procedural steps for wealthier litigants. This is irritating. For poorer people, it may be devastating. The law is theoretically available. Access to it is not always equal. You pass a small table where papers are being organised. A clerk ties one bundle with tape, another checks a name. The routines are almost soothing if you ignore what the documents may represent. Inheritance disputes, commercial debts, marriage settlements, land claims, unpaid obligations. The quiet rustle of paper can contain years of family resentment. There is also plenty of delay. Some legal proceedings, particularly in the Court of Chancery, acquire a notorious reputation for slowness and expense. Complaints about Chancery are widespread by the early 19th century, and reformers increasingly criticise procedures that can drag cases through years of uncertainty. Not every case becomes an endless nightmare, of course, but the reputation is strong enough that people joke about it. One satirical complaint imagines legal proceedings continuing so long that the original parties could practically become ancestors before anyone reaches the conclusion. Perhaps slightly unfair, perhaps not entirely. Researchers reconstructing everyday court practice still encounter uncertainty about exactly how particular rooms were used at particular moments. Because offices shifted, temporary arrangements changed, and descriptions by contemporary observers were not always consistent. For you, that ambiguity is easy to understand. You have been inside the palace only a short while, and already several doors seem capable of leading to 3 different centuries. A messenger suddenly appears with fresh papers. He hands them to an official, receives a brief instruction, and disappears again. Everything depends on movement. Documents move. People move, information moves, and yet the institution itself can feel wonderfully slow. You follow the sound of another proceeding. A witness is being questioned. The room has grown warm despite the cool morning outside. Wool coats hold body heat. Candles and fires add more. The air carries ink, dust, damp fabric, and that faint, stale quality produced whenever too many people occupy an old room with insufficient ventilation. Someone coughs. Someone else shifts on a bench. A lawyer continues speaking as if breathing were optional. You begin to appreciate how physically tiring participation in this system can be. There are long waits, hard benches, narrow passages, cold draughts in one room and oppressive warmth in another, and everywhere, paperwork at the edge of the chamber. A young clerk watches carefully. He may be learning procedure. He may also be wondering when he can eat. Both are perfectly respectable concerns. You leave the court and step back into the corridor. Behind you, another case continues. Ahead, political voices are beginning to replace legal ones. The route bends toward the part of the palace where laws are not merely interpreted but argued into existence. The rooms grow busier, footsteps become quicker. You pass an official carrying papers toward a chamber that was never designed to hold the political ambitions now packed inside it. Soon, you will enter the House of Commons, and compared with the patient formality of the courts, it promises to be considerably less patient. The corridor tightens again as you approach the House of Commons, and the first surprise is how little the place resembles the enormous chamber you may know from modern photographs. This room is smaller, much smaller. You enter carefully and immediately feel the walls closing around the business of government. The Commons meets inside what was once St. Stephen's Chapel, a medieval royal chapel transformed over time into a parliamentary chamber. The religious purpose has faded, but the shape of the old building still dictates how politics happens inside it. That matters more than you might expect. Members sit facing one another along opposing sides. There is no comfortable semicircle, no generous distance, no luxurious personal desk waiting for every politician. Benches run along the chamber, and when attendance is high, bodies are compressed together with an intimacy that probably does very little to improve political disagreement. You find a place near the edge and look around. The air is already warmer here than in the passages outside. More members arrive, coats brush against shoulders, shoes scrape along the floor, voices overlap, a clerk arranges papers. Someone squeezes past someone else without enough room for either man to pretend that it is graceful. The architecture encourages confrontation simply because everyone is facing everybody else. A speaker can rise and look directly toward opponents across a narrow floor. Words travel easily, so do reactions, murmurs, laughter, disapproval. Occasional cries from members who clearly feel that waiting for their turn is an unnecessary limitation placed upon democracy. The chamber has inherited its long rectangular form from the chapel, and the arrangement has helped shape one of the most recognisable traditions of British parliamentary debate. You are watching politics performed at close range, very close range, close enough, perhaps, to detect whether the gentleman opposite enjoyed onions with dinner. The speaker sits at one end, responsible for maintaining order in a room that occasionally regards order as an interesting theoretical concept. Nearby are clerks and officials who record proceedings and manage the practical rhythm of the House. Members come and go, some pay close attention, some whisper, some appear deeply absorbed in documents, and a few possess the timeless political skill of looking intensely thoughtful, while possibly thinking about absolutely nothing related to the speech being delivered. A member rises, conversation diminishes, not completely. This is still the Commons. He begins speaking about a matter of legislation. His delivery is slower than modern broadcasting might lead you to expect. There are no microphones. The room itself must carry his voice, and clarity depends on projection, silence from others, and the fortunate absence of someone coughing at exactly the wrong moment. The speech continues. You notice the galleries above. Spectators may gain access under varying arrangements. Although the relationship between Parliament and public reporting has long been complicated, parliamentary debates were not always officially open to straightforward publication. And newspapers found creative ways to report what happened. During earlier decades, some publications disguised parliamentary proceedings as debates from imaginary societies or foreign assemblies, allowing readers to understand perfectly well what was being described, while everyone maintained a remarkably thin layer of polite fiction. It is one of those wonderfully British arrangements in which a rule survives, partly because people become very talented at walking around it. By the 1830s, parliamentary reporting is far more established in public life. But the physical conditions inside the chamber remain deeply old-fashioned. Heat is becoming noticeable now. Candles contribute. Human bodies contribute more. Ventilation is imperfect. Windows and openings may help. But the old structure was never built for hundreds of men spending long hours arguing inside it. The smell changes as the session thickens. Wool, leather, tobacco clinging to clothing, paper, candle smoke, damp coats slowly warming. You begin to understand why 19th century descriptions of parliamentary interiors often pay attention to discomfort. Politics is not conducted in clean, neutral air, it happens inside atmosphere. A draught catches your neck from one direction, while heat presses against your face from another. Very efficient. You're simultaneously too warm and slightly cold. A second member rises. His voice is sharper. Another man reacts. A burst of laughter travels across the benches. The speaker intervenes. For a moment, the chamber settles. Then the debate resumes. The intimacy of the room gives exchanges an almost conversational aggression. Members can hear reactions immediately and adapt their speeches to them. A clever remark produces laughter. A weak argument may attract groans. A provocation can awaken members who seemed almost asleep moments earlier, and sleep is not an entirely ridiculous possibility. Sessions can continue late, very late. Parliamentary scheduling in this period often pushes debates into the night, which means members may enter this chamber after dinner and remain long after sensible people have gone to bed. The furniture does not improve in sympathy. The benches are built for sitting, not luxury. You shift your weight and imagine several hours here, then 10. Your enthusiasm for constitutional government becomes slightly more theoretical. One minor but revealing feature of Commons life is the struggle for physical space. There simply are not enough seats to accommodate every member comfortably at the same time. Important debates can therefore produce overcrowding, with members standing, squeezing into available positions, or trying to secure places early. Prestige does not guarantee legroom. That may be the most democratic feature in the building. You watch another document travel from hand to hand. Bills, amendments, notices, petitions, and reports feed the work of the chamber. Speeches attract attention, but paperwork sustains the process. There is a constant exchange between the visible drama of debate and the quieter mechanics performed by clerks. Researchers continue to puzzle over certain details of exactly how sound, crowding, and visibility shaped parliamentary behaviour in the old chamber, because contemporary accounts often describe the same atmosphere differently depending on where an observer sat and what political sympathies they carried inside with them. That seems fair. A crowded room can feel electrifying to one person and unbearable to another. Perhaps it is both. You remain near the wall as the debate moves onward. Someone speaks carefully, someone interrupts, someone laughs too loudly. The speaker restores order again. In the gallery, spectators lean forward. Below, members shuffle papers and exchange quick remarks. The chamber feels alive, compressed, overheated, slightly chaotic, and intensely human. You had entered the palace imagining government as something abstract. Laws, institutions, constitution. Now it has bodies, sweaty ones. It has cramped knees, tired backs, sore throats, candle smoke, impatience, jokes, rivalries, and men trying to make themselves heard across a floor that is only a few strides wide. And yet from this inconvenient former chapel come decisions that reach far beyond Westminster: taxes, trade, reform, war, public spending, rights. The room is physically small, its consequences are not. Eventually you slip back toward the doorway. Behind you, the argument continues without needing your assistance. The corridor outside feels almost cool. You breathe more easily. But the palace has another chamber waiting, one with a different atmosphere, different rituals, and a much more visible relationship with rank. You turn toward the House of Lords. The air ahead seems quieter, more ceremonial, and considerably more interested in reminding everyone who is important. The transition toward the House of Lords feels almost ceremonial before you even reach the chamber. The corridors seem quieter, the traffic is different. There are still clerks, messengers, attendants, and officials moving with purpose. But the atmosphere carries more visible hierarchy. Clothing becomes finer, movements become more measured. People seem increasingly aware not only of where they're going, but of who is entitled to go there. You pass through another doorway and enter a world in which politics is wrapped in ceremony. The Chamber of the Lords occupies a part of the old palace with deep historical associations. It is not merely a debating room, it is a space where monarchy, aristocracy, religion, and parliament overlap in ways that can be read almost directly from the furniture. You notice the seating first. Peers occupy benches according to established conventions. Bishops sit among them as lords spiritual, reminders that the upper chamber is not purely secular. Hereditary nobles dominate much of the membership. While senior judges and officers of state contribute their own forms of authority, the chamber is political, but it also resembles a diagram of the British establishment rendered in cloth, wood, and human posture. At one end stands the royal throne. Even when the monarch is absent, its presence matters. It signals that Parliament exists within a constitutional order, in which Crown and legislature remain symbolically connected. You look toward it and feel the peculiar tension of the room. Government is conducted here by argument. But tradition surrounds the argument. A peer rises, the chamber quiets. His voice travels across the room without the crowded aggression you encountered in the Commons. There are interruptions, certainly, and disagreement can be severe, but the rhythm tends to feel more controlled. Titles matter, procedure matters, who speaks, when they speak, and how they address the chamber all belong to a culture of rank. That does not mean everyone is dignified every minute. No institution containing human beings has achieved that. You notice one nobleman shifting with visible impatience. Another appears distracted. A bishop listens with his hands folded. Someone farther away leans toward a neighbour and murmurs something that produces a restrained smile. Apparently even aristocratic government requires whispering during speeches. The House of Lords in the early 19th century remains a profoundly elite institution. Most peers hold their seats through hereditary right, while bishops of the Church of England occupy places because of ecclesiastical office. That arrangement places enormous political influence in the hands of a relatively small social group, and the contrast with the country outside these walls is difficult to miss. Beyond Westminster, Britain is changing quickly. Factories expand, cities grow. New wealth accumulates through industry and trade. Large populations live in towns whose political representation often bears little relationship to their actual size. Inside this chamber, however, ancient titles still carry direct legislative power. You hear fabric rustling as several peers shift on their benches. Ceremonial dress can make appearances particularly striking on formal occasions, though ordinary sittings are less theatrical than the most elaborate state ceremonies. Still, rank is visible everywhere. You can often tell who belongs before anyone speaks. The Lord Chancellor occupies a distinctive place in the chamber and traditionally sits upon the woolsack, a large seat associated symbolically with the historic importance of wool to the English economy. It is an oddly practical symbol. No marble eagle, no golden lion, a sack of wool. Well, not exactly an ordinary sack, but the principle is charmingly direct. Britain's legislature has remembered that before empire, finance, and industrial machinery. A great deal of national wealth once walked around fields making sheep noises. That little detail would be easy to dismiss as decorative tradition, but it tells you something important about Westminster. Objects here carry memory. A seat is not simply a seat. A doorway may represent a privilege. A robe may represent office. A procession may express constitutional hierarchy. Even the distance between people can mean something. You watch an attendant move carefully through the chamber. Nothing about his work is accidental. Ceremony depends on invisible labour. Doors must open at the right moment. Documents must be in the right place. Messages must travel correctly. Clothing, furniture, seating, and procedure all require people whose names rarely appear in grand political histories. Remember the clerks carrying papers through the passages earlier. They are never far away. The lords may embody prestige, but prestige still needs somebody to bring the documents. A debate continues. The issue concerns legislation that has already passed through other stages. That is another key feature of Parliament's structure. The Commons and Lords form separate chambers, and legislation usually requires agreement through both before receiving royal assent. The two houses therefore inhabit the same palace while maintaining distinct identities. You can almost feel the difference architecturally. The Commons feels compressed and argumentative. The Lords feels layered and ceremonial. One is not necessarily calmer in substance. It simply dresses disagreement differently. You move your attention upward. The old chamber contains decorative features accumulated and altered through time, and not every reconstruction of its appearance before 1834 is perfectly certain. Later accounts, drawings, architectural records, and surviving plans allow much to be recovered, but specialists still differ over some details of how particular furnishings and spaces were arranged during different phases of alteration. That uncertainty is especially understandable here because Westminster changes constantly. Furniture moves, rooms are repaired, galleries are modified, temporary structures become semi-permanent. Someone improvises a solution. Then 50 years later, everyone acts as though it has always been there. Very traditional. The Lords also carries memories of national drama. The opening of Parliament brings the monarch into this part of the palace for ceremonies that transform the building. Robes appear, officials assemble, heraldic display intensifies. The ordinary working corridors become stages for constitutional theatre. Yet, on a routine day, much of life is quieter. There are papers, conversations, waiting. Committee work, members arriving late, members leaving early. The grand machinery of state spends a surprising amount of time doing ordinary things. You begin to notice the bishops more carefully. Their presence reminds you that political power in Britain is intertwined with the established church. Religion is not merely private belief here, it has institutional representation. A bishop may contribute to debate on education, social policy, law, or moral questions. The combination can seem strange from a modern perspective, but in this period it is embedded in the constitutional landscape. You stand quietly as another peer begins speaking. His tone is slow. The chamber seems warmer now, not as oppressive as the Commons, perhaps, but the candles and bodies still alter the air. You smell wax, old wood, cloth, paper, a faint trace of smoke outside these walls. The river continues flowing past the palace, carrying barges and boats through London. Inside, traditions move much more slowly. You can almost imagine time thickening here, but not stopping. Pressure for political reform is already building strongly by the early 1830s. Questions of representation, privilege, and institutional power are increasingly difficult to avoid. The old palace shelters an old political system while the country around it transforms. And yet, when you look past the robes and titles, the chamber becomes human again. A man rubs his forehead. Another checks a paper twice. An attendant suppresses a yawn. Someone waits for a colleague who has not arrived. The dignity survives. Barely. You ease back toward the corridor. Behind you, the peers continue debating. Ahead, you can hear softer sounds. Pens scratching, pages turning, footsteps measured by habit rather than ceremony. The speeches may command attention, but the institution cannot function on speeches alone. Beyond the chamber doors waits the quieter workforce that remembers procedure, records decisions, copies documents, carries messages, and somehow keeps centuries of parliamentary custom from collapsing into confusion. You follow the sound of ink meeting paper. The scratching of pens grows clearer as you move away from the chamber and into rooms where Parliament becomes less theatrical and more mechanical. Here, nobody is delivering a grand speech. Nobody is rising to thunder against a bill. Nobody is waving a paper dramatically enough to make the galleries lean forward. Instead, men sit at desks. They read, they copy, they check, they carry, and without them, almost everything you have just witnessed would begin falling apart within hours. You enter a room lined with shelves and tables, papers lie in ordered bundles, inkstands sit within easy reach, quills rest beside folded documents. The air carries the dry smell of paper, leather bindings, dust, and ink. A clerk bends over a page. His handwriting is small and controlled. He does not rush. That would be dangerous. Parliament depends on accuracy. A word inserted incorrectly into a bill can alter meaning. A name copied badly can create confusion. A date placed in the wrong line may delay business. Votes must be recorded. Orders must be preserved. Messages must pass between the Commons and the Lords without becoming mysteriously improved along the way. So these quiet rooms form a kind of memory system. Human memory, assisted by paper. You watch one clerk compare two documents line by line. He pauses, checks again, then makes a small correction. That movement is almost invisible compared with the noise of a debate, but it may matter just as much. By the early 19th century, the two houses of Parliament already depend on highly developed clerical staffs. Senior clerks understand procedure in extraordinary detail, while assistants, copyists, doorkeepers, messengers, and other officers keep information moving through the institution. Some positions are old enough to carry traditions that make perfect sense only if you have spent years inside Westminster, which, unfortunately, is exactly how Westminster likes things. You follow a messenger into the corridor. He carries a folded paper. Nothing remarkable, except the entire building seems to run on folded papers. Messages travel from committees to chambers, from chamber to chamber, from members to officials, from offices to printers, and back again. There is no telephone, no electronic notification, no message flashing instantly across a screen. If someone needs information delivered, a person must physically take it somewhere. So political communication has footsteps. You hear them constantly, fast when a division approaches, steady when documents are routine, careful when the messenger is carrying something that absolutely must not be misplaced. A doorkeeper stands near an entrance. His role may appear simple, but access is power inside Westminster. Not everyone may enter every room. Members belong in some spaces, officials belong in others, visitors require permission. Strangers wandering cheerfully toward the wrong door tend to be stopped. You would know. You've already taken enough wrong turns to qualify as a minor security concern. The doorkeeper recognizes faces. That matters enormously in a world without plastic identification cards. Long familiarity with members, officers, messengers, and regular visitors becomes a practical form of security. The institution operates partly through people knowing who ought to be where. A new member may need guidance. A familiar official receives only a glance. Someone uncertain is questioned. Westminster is governed by rules, but many rules are enforced through habit. Further along, you enter another office. The light is better here. A window provides enough daylight to reduce dependence on candles. Though cloudy London skies are not always cooperative. Several clerks sit at separate desks. their work arranged in careful stacks. One reaches for sealing wax. Another turns a page in a ledger. You hear the soft crackle of a fire nearby. For all the importance of these records, their physical vulnerability is striking. Paper burns, wax melts, wooden shelves burn, timber partitions burn. You barely notice this thought before the room returns to its ordinary calm. For now, there is no emergency, only work. One curious feature of parliamentary administration is the survival of offices with medieval or early modern origins long after the practical world around them has changed. Some titles sound almost ceremonial, yet the people holding them may perform very real administrative tasks. This is Westminster's favourite trick. It preserves an ancient name and quietly changes everything behind it. You could work beside someone whose office title sounds as though he should be carrying a sword before Henry VIII, while his actual day is mostly spent checking documents. History is efficient that way. It rarely throws away a good title. You move toward a table where several papers relate to petitions. Petitions are an important part of parliamentary life. Individuals, towns, religious groups, commercial interests, reform organisations, and others may present requests or grievances to Parliament. Some concern national questions, others are intensely local: taxes, roads, trade restrictions, political representation, religious disabilities, public works. A single petition might represent hundreds or thousands of signatures. Someone must receive it, someone must classify it, someone must record that it arrived. Someone must know what happens next. Again, the speeches depend on paperwork. A clerk turns one large sheet carefully so it does not tear. You imagine the people whose names may be attached to it. They are not in the room. Many will never visit Westminster, but their concerns have entered the building on paper. That is how distant voices become physically present. Not loudly, not dramatically, folded, signed, delivered. A senior clerk passes through, and the atmosphere shifts slightly. Others acknowledge him. He carries no visible badge of grandeur. His authority lies in knowledge. Procedure in Parliament can be extraordinarily intricate. Questions about precedents, wording, sequence, privilege, amendments, and voting practice may depend on customs accumulated over generations. Members argue politics. Clerks often remember how the argument is supposed to proceed. There are moments when an experienced clerk's memory may be more useful than a shelf of books, and because procedure develops gradually. Specialists do not always agree on exactly when certain informal practices became established. Surviving journals describe official business well, but they do not capture every whispered instruction, shortcut, or habitual routine used by clerks behind the scenes. That missing layer is important. Institutions are never made only of written rules. They are also made of things everyone knows without writing down: where to stand, whom to ask, which staircase is quicker, which member always loses his papers, which official becomes unpleasant when disturbed before breakfast. These details rarely survive neatly in archives, but they shape everyday life. You pause beside another doorway. A messenger returns. The document he carried earlier is gone. His hands are empty now. Mission accomplished. No applause, no historical painting. He simply turns around and receives another task. That may be the best description of Westminster's hidden workforce. Finish one thing, begin another. A clerk replaces a document on a shelf. A doorkeeper opens a door. A copyist dips his pen. A servant carries coal past the office entrance. The grand institution continues because hundreds of ordinary actions happen correctly in the right order. You leave the clerks behind and follow the man carrying coal. The polished language of Parliament begins to fade. The corridors become less impressive. You descend a staircase. The smell of paper gives way to soot, food, damp stone, and warm air rising from service spaces below. Here, The palace is maintained by people whose work is even easier to overlook, and government, you're about to discover, requires an astonishing amount of sweeping, carrying, heating, cleaning, fetching, and lifting. The staircase leads downward into a different Westminster. The voices of peers and MPs fade above you. The air becomes heavier, stone walls press closer, the floor is rougher beneath your feet, and the smell changes almost immediately from paper and candle wax to soot. Damp masonry, boiled food, leather, ashes, and the warm animal scent of people doing physical work. This is the palace beneath the speeches. You pass a servant carrying a basket. Another man lifts coal from a storage area and transfers it into smaller containers for delivery upstairs. Somewhere nearby, metal strikes stone with a dull clink. A door opens, releasing a brief wave of heat and the smell of broth, onions, and something roasting. The old palace depends on fires, not one great furnace warming everything neatly from a central system. Many fires, fireplaces, kitchen hearths, stoves, braziers in some contexts, candles and lamps for light. Every useful flame requires fuel, tending, cleaning, and attention. That means somebody must carry coal or wood through corridors that were never designed for efficient delivery. Somebody must remove ash. Somebody must relight a fire that has gone out. Somebody must notice when a chimney is drawing badly. You follow a coal carrier through a narrow service passage. His work is repetitive, heavy, dirty, and absolutely necessary. An MP may deliver a magnificent speech on constitutional principle, but if the chamber is freezing, constitutional principle becomes considerably harder to appreciate. The same is true of the courts, the clerks, the offices, the residential rooms. Heat in the palace is a daily logistical problem. You begin to see black dust along corners where fuel has been moved repeatedly. Soot clings to surfaces. The man ahead of you has dark marks on his sleeves despite whatever effort he made that morning to remain clean. There is a quiet irony here. The more respectable the room upstairs, the more invisible the labour required to keep it comfortable. That pattern runs through the entire building. You enter a service area where water is being handled. There is no modern plumbing network performing every task automatically. Water must often be fetched, carried, stored, heated, poured, emptied, and fetched again. Buckets appear everywhere. So do hands reddened by cold water. A cleaner bends over a floor, scrubbing away mud brought in by the steady traffic of boots. London streets are hardly generous to clean interiors. Rain produces filth. Horses contribute enthusiastically. The river air carries dampness. Coal smoke settles over everything. Keeping Westminster presentable is less a completed task than a negotiation with dirt. You watch the cleaner finish one section. Several men immediately walk across it. Excellent, a profession built on optimism. The palace employs or accommodates a complicated mixture of servants, attendants, keepers, household workers, porters, and others whose exact duties can overlap. Some are attached to particular offices or chambers. Others maintain portions of the building. Certain roles come with long traditions, while others exist because someone, at some point, discovered that a practical problem required a person to solve it every day. The surviving administrative records make the broad structure clear, but everyday boundaries between tasks were not always as tidy as later job descriptions might suggest. In an old building, whoever is nearest may occasionally become the solution. You move toward the kitchen smells. Heat increases. A working kitchen in the palace is not a delicate domestic space. It is a place of fuel, knives, pots, steam, grease, heavy vessels, storage, and constant movement. Workers prepare food for people who may be here for many hours. Meals have to fit around parliamentary schedules that do not care whether the cook finds them convenient. A pot simmers. A servant lifts a lid and immediately leans away from the steam. Another carries a tray toward the stairs. You catch the smell of meat, bread, and gravy. It is comforting for approximately 3 seconds. Then another door opens and releases smoke. Less comforting. Food service inside Westminster develops around the peculiar habits of political life. Members and officials may eat at irregular hours, especially when sittings stretch into the evening. Refreshment spaces become important not only for hunger, but for conversation. But you're not following the gossip yet, for now. You stay with the people making that gossip physically possible by carrying the plates. A young servant passes you quickly with a tray balanced in both hands. He turns sideways through a narrow opening. The tray survives. So does the wall, a small victory. Storage rooms sit nearby. You find shelves holding supplies that would seem completely mundane if they were not inside one of the most politically important buildings in the country. Candles, cleaning materials, fuel, food, utensils, cloths, tools. The palace consumes ordinary things constantly. That is easy to forget when history focuses on speeches and legislation. Institutions eat. They burn fuel. They create rubbish. They break furniture. They stain floors. They need repairs. You hear a hammer somewhere farther along. Maintenance never really ends. The building is old enough that something is always loosening, leaking, cracking, sticking, smoking, or refusing to behave. A door swells in damp weather. A roof admits water. A fireplace needs attention. A window latch fails. A stair tread wears down. Westminster survives through repair layered upon repair. There is a slightly strange domestic quality to parts of the palace as well. Official apartments and residential arrangements place families and household life surprisingly close to government business. Children, wives, servants, and personal possessions can exist within a complex that outsiders imagine purely as a stage for national politics. A forgotten glove, a cooking pot, a sleeping room, laundry. These things coexist with legislation. One lesser-known feature of old institutional buildings like Westminster is just how porous the boundary could be between public office and private occupation. A keeper or official might inhabit rooms tied directly to his post, bringing domestic routines into the architecture of government. You notice this in small traces: a cloth drying near a passage, a chair positioned beside a warmer wall, a cup left where no formal ceremony would ever acknowledge it. The palace has a household hidden inside its bureaucracy. You pass another fire, this one burns low. A worker kneels and adjusts it, coaxing the coals until orange light returns beneath the grey surface. The gesture is simple. It will also become impossible not to remember later. Fire here is ordinary, useful, necessary, everywhere. That does not yet feel threatening. The workers treat it with the familiarity of people who have tended flames all their lives. Still, the palace around those flames contains timber partitions, old roof structures, paper records, cloth, furniture, and centuries of alterations that create concealed spaces where heat can travel in unexpected ways. You do not linger on that thought. Not yet. There are still servants moving through the passage, still meals being prepared, still ash being removed, still water being carried. Nothing is wrong. A porter pushes open a heavy door and steps aside for you. You return gradually toward a busier level. The smell of kitchens follows you upward. Then another scent joins it. Tobacco, coffee, ale, warm food. You hear laughter before you see where it comes from. The formal palace is about to become social again. And behind the next doorway, political life is loosening its collar. The laughter grows louder as you approach the refreshment rooms. After the soot, buckets, coal and kitchen heat below, this part of Westminster feels almost luxurious, not truly luxurious. Perhaps, but certainly more comfortable. Tables are occupied, cups and glasses appear, plates come and go, tobacco smoke hangs in soft layers beneath the ceiling. You enter carefully. Conversation moves faster here than in the chambers. Nobody waits for the speaker. Nobody rises formally. Nobody needs permission to interrupt. That alone makes the room feel revolutionary. Members of Parliament, lawyers, clerks, visitors, and political acquaintances use these spaces for meals and drinks. But food is only part of the attraction. Information moves with it. A man leans across a table and lowers his voice. Another listens. A third pretends not to. You quickly understand that Westminster has two systems of communication. One is official. It is written in journals, spoken in debates, entered into records, and carried through proper channels. The other happens over dinner. You stand near a wall while a servant places a plate before a gentleman who has clearly been waiting longer than he considers acceptable. The meal is simple enough. Bread, meat, perhaps vegetables, something warm, something filling. Parliamentary sittings can extend for hours, and members need somewhere to eat without leaving the complex entirely. Refreshment facilities therefore become essential to the working rhythm of the palace. The hours are unpredictable. A debate may finish earlier than expected, or it may continue deep into the night. A division may be called when someone has just begun eating. Political life is not especially respectful of digestion. A member takes 2 quick bites and glances toward the door. He looks like a man preparing to abandon dinner for democracy. The potatoes will understand. You move deeper into the room. Smoke thickens. Tobacco's part of everyday male sociability in this period, and the scent clings to clothing, upholstery, curtains, and woodwork. Pipes and cigars appear in the wider social world around Parliament, even if particular rooms and moments have their own rules. Add coal smoke from London, candle smoke indoors, kitchen fumes, and hundreds of wool coats, and the palace acquires an atmosphere no modern ventilation consultant would describe with confidence. Yet the people around you seem accustomed to it. A gentleman lifts a glass, another orders something. Coffee circulates alongside stronger drinks. Ale, wine, and spirits are familiar parts of 19th century dining culture. Though not every member drinks heavily and not every conversation becomes a tavern scene, still, alcohol is never very far from British political sociability. This has consequences. An evening sitting after dinner can contain members who are tired, irritated, overfed, underfed, or perhaps more cheerful than parliamentary procedure strictly requires. You hear a burst of laughter from one table. The cause appears to be a story about another politician, not policy. The politician. This is where reputation is built and damaged. A clever speech in the chamber may impress the public. A foolish remark over supper may impress colleagues in a very different way. You draw slightly closer. The men are discussing an upcoming vote. One believes support is secure, another disagrees, a third claims to know how several members will divide. The conversation is casual, but the subject is not. Many political decisions begin long before anyone stands formally in the chamber. Support must be counted, alliances tested, objections softened, promises interpreted, rumours checked. A meal provides excellent cover for all of it. Political historians can reconstruct formal divisions and speeches with considerable precision. Yet these informal conversations leave a much thinner documentary trail. Diaries, letters, memoirs, and newspaper reports preserve fragments, but nobody records every whispered bargain made over a plate of beef. That missing evidence matters because politics is often decided in spaces that produce no official minutes. The room around you is one of them. You sit for a moment near an empty corner. It feels almost pleasant. Warm food, low conversation, the clink of glass, the scrape of cutlery, a servant moving between tables. If you ignore the smoke, you might even become comfortable. Then someone opens the door and a wave of colder corridor air pushes through the room. Several candles flicker. A paper napkin shifts. Nobody reacts. Small disturbances are constant here. One old Westminster curiosity is the presence of refreshment and social spaces so close to the chambers that a member might move from intense national debate to dinner conversation within minutes. He could be condemning government policy at one moment and asking for more gravy at the next. History rarely gives you enough gravy. You hear another conversation. This one concerns a speech delivered earlier. The men are already rewriting it in memory. One claims the speaker was brilliant. Another says he was tedious. A third insists that half the house was asleep. All three may sincerely believe themselves. That is another hidden life of Parliament. The official record preserves words. Human memory preserves impressions. The two are not always the same across the room. A newspaper appears. Someone scans it quickly. The relationship between Parliament and the press has changed enormously across the previous century. Reporting debates, once treated with suspicion and restrictions, has become increasingly central to political life. By the 1830s, newspapers help carry parliamentary discussion far beyond Westminster. The public does not need to stand in a gallery to know what was said, or at least what the newspaper says was said. You watch the reader frown. Perhaps he dislikes the report. Politicians discovering that journalists have summarized them badly is not a modern invention. He folds the paper, very firmly. A nearby servant wisely finds something else to look at. The social world here includes more than MPs. Officials and visitors circulate through overlapping networks of influence. Invitations, introductions, friendships, family connections, patronage, and professional relationships all matter. Westminster is an institution. It is also a village of people who repeatedly encounter one another. They know who is ambitious, who is unreliable, who speaks well, who talks too much, who owes whom a favour, who has annoyed everyone this week. The formal structure sits on top of an informal map of personalities. You notice a younger man listening carefully to an older one. He barely speaks. Perhaps that is deliberate in political life. Knowing when not to speak can be a useful skill, especially during dinner. The room has become warmer. Smoke floats beneath the lamps. Someone calls for another drink. Elsewhere, a small disagreement begins over a policy question and quickly becomes louder than necessary. Neither man seems angry enough to stop eating. Encouraging. You begin to see how these spaces act as pressure valves inside the chambers. Language is regulated by procedure. Here, frustration can escape more freely. Members complain, joke, gossip, predict, mock, negotiate, recover. Then they return upstairs and become formal again, or attempt to. You leave your place and move toward the doorway. A servant passes carrying used plates toward the kitchens. The physical loop of Westminster continues. Food rises. Dirty dishes descend. Information circulates in both directions. You step back into the corridor for a moment. The quieter air feels refreshing. Behind you, the room continues humming with male voices, but the palace is not entirely male. Women are present too, though often at its edges, in controlled spaces, domestic roles, service work, galleries, petitions, and social networks that official political history can easily overlook. You turn toward another passage. There, beyond the obvious centres of power, Westminster begins revealing who is allowed to be visible, who is expected to remain discreet, and how women navigate a political world built largely for men. You notice this difference before anyone explains it. The men move through Westminster as though the building belongs to them. They cross corridors without hesitation. They enter offices, chambers, refreshment rooms, and committee spaces according to rank, office or business. Their presence feels expected. Women move differently, more carefully, more selectively. often through spaces that are permitted rather than assumed. You follow a quieter corridor and begin to see just how misleading the phrase men's political world can be. The formal machinery of Parliament is overwhelmingly male in the early 19th century. Women cannot sit as MPs. They cannot vote in parliamentary elections. They do not occupy the legislative benches where laws are argued and decided. Yet that does not mean Westminster is empty of women. Far from it. A maid passes carrying folded linen. Another woman moves toward a service stair with a basket on her arm. Some women work in domestic roles connected with offices or official residences. Others arrive as visitors, wives, relatives, petitioners, spectators, or members of politically active networks. Their access is limited. Their influence is not always. You pause near an entrance where a small group waits. One woman holds a folded document tightly between gloved hands. She looks tired, determined. Perhaps both. The paper may contain a petition. Petitioning offers one route by which people excluded from direct political power can still address Parliament. Women sign and organise petitions on a variety of issues, including religious causes, social reform, economic hardship, abolition, and local grievances. A signature is not a vote, but it is not silence either. You look at the folded sheet again. The woman does not need a seat in the Commons for her name to enter parliamentary business. That distinction matters. Across Britain, women participate in political culture through correspondence, associations, fundraising, petitions, family influence, public campaigns, and social networks. Much of that activity happens beyond the formal chamber, which, conveniently for historians, makes it harder to measure. You move onward, a door opens above you. Female voices drift briefly from a gallery area before disappearing behind wood and stone. Women can observe parliamentary proceedings under restrictions that vary over time, and their presence in the galleries has often been treated as a problem to be managed rather than a normal part of political life. The arrangement can be physically absurd in earlier periods. Women watching Commons debates were sometimes confined behind barriers or screens intended to limit visibility between observers and members. Imagine attending one of the most important political institutions in the country and being told that your participation may consist of listening through architectural inconvenience. Very welcoming. Westminster's always understood hospitality in its own special way. One of the strangest episodes connected with female spectators comes from the 18th century, when women resisted attempts to remove them from parliamentary galleries. Contemporary accounts describe confrontations in which determined female visitors refused to surrender their places quietly. The image is wonderfully revealing. A supposedly passive audience becomes anything but passive when someone tries to close the door. By the 1830s, women remain excluded from formal membership. But political awareness among female spectators is certainly not absent. You imagine them listening from above. They hear the same speeches. They form opinions. They repeat arguments later at dinner tables, in drawing rooms, in letters, and among friends. Politics leaks out of Westminster through conversation just as surely as through newspapers. You continue toward a more domestic portion of the complex. Here, another kind of female presence becomes visible. Some officials and servants live within or adjacent to the palace precincts, and where there are households, there are wives, daughters, female servants, laundry, cooking, childcare, and all the ordinary rhythms of domestic life. A woman carries clothing across a room, another adjusts something near a hearth. The sounds are small: fabric, a cupboard door, a spoon against pottery. They seem almost absurdly ordinary when you remember that a few passages away, legislation is being debated. This is one of Westminster's hidden contradictions. National government and domestic routine occupy the same physical world. A child could conceivably be sleeping near rooms where state business is conducted. A servant might cross paths with a peer while carrying washing. A wife may hear political gossip before it reaches a newspaper simply because she lives close to the people discussing it. The palace is not a sealed temple of politics. It is inhabited. You pass a woman speaking quietly with an older gentleman. Their conversation is private. Perhaps she is his wife, perhaps a relative, perhaps someone seeking assistance. Family relationships form another route into influence. Elite women, especially those connected to politically active households, can participate indirectly in patronage. Introductions, correspondence, and social organization, dinner invitations, marriages, friendships, and drawing room conversations help shape political relationships. No parliamentary journal records who persuaded whom during tea. That does not mean persuasion did not happen. Researchers trying to reconstruct this informal political world often encounter precisely that problem. Official archives preserve speeches, votes, bills, and petitions much more reliably than private conversations. Subtle social pressure, or the influence of people whose names never entered formal records. The absence of documentation can easily look like the absence of activity. It is not the same thing. You watch another visitor move along the corridor accompanied by a man who clearly knows the building better than she does. She glances upward at the walls. Perhaps this is her first visit. She may have come partly from curiosity. Westminster attracts spectators because politics has become increasingly public and newsworthy. By the early 19th century, parliamentary personalities can become widely known figures. Speeches circulate, cartoons circulate, scandals circulate even faster. A visitor may arrive already knowing which politician she hopes to see. Human nature remains reassuringly consistent. You can build a constitution around it, but eventually someone will still want to know whether the famous speaker looks shorter in person. A maid emerges from a side passage and nearly collides with you. You move aside. She barely notices. Her day is busy. Service work does not become lighter because Parliament is important. Floors need cleaning, rooms need preparing, food needs carrying, beds in residential quarters need attention, clothing needs washing and mending. Women performing this labour occupy some of the least celebrated positions in the palace. Yet they may know its practical geography better than many MPs. They know which staircase saves time, which corridor is cold, which room leaves soot on everything, which gentleman complains, which door sticks when the weather turns damp. There is knowledge in service. It simply does not appear in speeches. You climb toward a gallery again. The sound of debate filters through walls and openings. A male voice rises. Then another, somewhere nearby. Women listen. The separation is architectural, legal, and cultural, but it is never complete. Ideas cross it. Rumours cross it. Family relationships cross it. Petitions cross it. Even frustration crosses it. You remain there for a moment, hearing Parliament without seeing all of it. Perhaps that is an appropriate position from which to understand women in Old Westminster. Present, attentive, constrained, often pushed toward the margins, yet never entirely outside the political world. The debate continues below. The light beyond the windows is changing now. The day is moving toward evening. Candles will soon matter more. Meals will be finished. Members will return to the chambers. And as darkness settles over London, Westminster will reveal another side of itself, a building that refuses to go to sleep. The windows darken gradually until the outside world becomes little more than black glass reflecting the rooms back at themselves. Westminster does not stop, if anything. The palace becomes stranger at night. Candles multiply, lamps are lit, fires are fed. The old passages glow unevenly. bright near doorways and shadowed between them. Every flame creates a small island of visibility, leaving corners to dissolve into darkness. You move back toward the commons and hear voices before you reach the chamber. The debate is still going. Of course it is. Outside, respectable households across London are settling toward bed. Curtains are drawn, kitchens cool, children sleep, servants finish the last chores of the day. Here, men are beginning another argument. Late sittings are a familiar part of parliamentary life in this period. The working day of the House of Commons often starts later than a modern office schedule and may continue well into the night, particularly when important legislation or contentious business is under discussion. That rhythm shapes everything around it. Servants stay awake, clerks stay awake, reporters stay awake, doorkeepers stay awake, cooks prepare food at unreasonable hours, and somewhere in Westminster, a candlemaker is probably grateful. You enter the chamber. Heat meets you first. The room that felt crowded earlier now feels used. The air is heavy from bodies, lamps, candles, tobacco clinging to clothes, and hours of occupation. Papers have accumulated on benches. Some members sit forward with renewed attention. Others look as though parliamentary duty is attempting to kill them through boredom. A speaker is on his feet. His voice remains steady, impressive. You have been walking through the palace all day and are already considering the emotional benefits of a mattress. Several members round him are plainly tired. One stretches his legs as far as the cramped seating allows. Another rubs his face. A third leans backward with his eyes closed for slightly longer than seems necessary. Is he reflecting deeply on constitutional principle? Possibly. Let us be generous. The chamber erupts briefly in laughter, and his eyes open at once. Remarkable recovery. Night debates have their own energy. Fatigue can make speeches shorter, or much longer. A member who's been waiting hours to speak may have accumulated enough frustration to address every point made since sunset. Patience grows thin, tempers can sharpen, humour becomes more valuable. A well-timed joke can revive the room far more effectively than a carefully constructed paragraph about taxation. You find a place near the edge and listen. Someone objects. Another answers. Members call out. The speaker attempts to keep the discussion moving. Procedure is doing heroic work. The room is physically small enough that reactions spread instantly. A whisper becomes a murmur becomes laughter. A hostile remark crosses the chamber before the original speaker has fully sat down. No microphone separates the politician from his audience. He must feel the room directly. That intimacy helps explain why parliamentary speaking develops as a responsive performance rather than a simple prepared lecture. You speak to the people in front of you. They answer. Sometimes, before you have requested that service, the Commons is also shaped by divisions. The formal votes in which members physically separate according to their position, when a division is called. Members must be present to vote. Bells and messengers alert those nearby, including men who may be eating or speaking elsewhere within the palace precincts. Imagine having finally obtained dinner after hours of debate, only to hear that your constitutional presence is immediately required. The gravy suffers again. Politics is cruel. You follow the movement as several men enter hurriedly. One is fastening his coat. Another still appears to be chewing. There are moments when the grandeur of parliamentary government becomes extremely difficult to maintain. The practical system, though, is serious. Votes can be close. Attendance matters. Political managers pay careful attention to who is present, who has left, who is expected back, and who might be persuaded to remain for another hour. The exhaustion itself becomes part of politics, if business runs late enough. Physical endurance can influence participation. A member who lives nearby has advantages over one who must travel farther. An elderly politician may struggle more than a younger one. Someone in poor health may leave despite the importance of the issue. The institution assumes bodies can keep pace with procedure. Bodies frequently disagree. You leave the chamber briefly. The corridor outside is quieter but not asleep. A clerk passes holding several documents. His face looks pale in candlelight. A servant carries fresh candles. Another brings fuel. You hear footsteps descending toward the refreshment rooms. The entire palace has shifted into nocturnal mode. During daylight, architecture guides you through windows and open courtyards. At night, fire becomes navigation. A lamp marks a doorway. A candle reveals a staircase. Light leaks beneath doors where people are still working. Beyond that circle of illumination, the old palace can feel almost medieval again. You descend several steps and hear the Thames outside. The river's invisible, but the sound reaches you through the night. Water against stone, an oar, a distant call. Boats remain useful for reaching Westminster, and the river provides a route through London at hours when streets may be inconvenient, crowded or poorly lit. One rather charming consequence of Westminster's riverside position is that political life has long been linked to watermen. Members, officials, and visitors could arrive or depart by boat, carrying parliamentary business into the darkness while the Thames quietly performed the job of a highway. You imagine a tired MP leaving after midnight. He steps into a small boat. The chamber disappears behind him. The river takes over for perhaps 20 minutes. Nobody can interrupt his speech because he is no longer giving one. Bliss. Back inside. You encounter another cluster of members. Their discussion is quieter now. The subject seems important. Fatigue has stripped away some of the performance. Late hours can produce strange intimacy. Men who spend the day attacking one another politically may stand beside the same fire afterward, sharing complaints about the hour, the weather, or the quality of dinner. Political enemies still become cold at the same temperature. That is reassuring. Accounts of parliamentary nights differ greatly depending on who wrote them. Some observers portray late sittings as energetic displays of commitment and wit. Others describe stretches of tedium, sparse attendance, and men struggling to remain alert while speeches continue. The truth probably changes from night to night, and even from bench to bench. You can understand both descriptions. At one moment the Commons feels alive. 10 minutes later, a speech begins discussing a technical financial detail and time seems to stop completely. A member near you suppresses a yawn. You almost join him. The speaker remains in place. Clerks continue recording business. That is perhaps the most impressive endurance in the room. They cannot simply decide that a speech has become boring enough to stop existing. Every formal step still matters. Words must be noted, decisions recorded, documents prepared for whatever follows. The clerical world you visited earlier is still operating beneath the fatigue. Ink continues meeting paper. You pass one writing desk where candlelight flickers over wet handwriting. The clerk pauses and looks toward the flame. His face is only inches from it. The candle burns steadily. There are thousands of ordinary moments like this across the palace. A flame beside paper, a lamp near wood, a fire behind a grate. Everyone accepts the arrangement because there is no practical alternative. Night requires light. Cold requires heat. Work requires both. For now, they are simply tools. The hour grows later. You return once more toward the chamber. A new speaker rises. Some members groan softly. Perhaps at his argument. Perhaps at the prospect of another hour. It is difficult to know. You realize that Westminster may continue like this long after you would willingly surrender. The palace has become an organism that runs beyond ordinary domestic time. It eats late, argues late, writes late, burns candles late, and eventually, when the debate finally ends, hundreds of small flames will have to be extinguished. Rooms closed, papers gathered, fires watched, and exhausted bodies sent home. That routine has happened night after night. It feels normal, and normal habits are often the easiest dangers to stop noticing. You leave the commons behind as another candle is replaced. Ahead, in the old walls, timber partitions, crowded offices, fireplaces, records, chimneys, and hidden voids begin to form a pattern you've been seeing all day without quite recognizing. Westminster is full of fire, and Westminster is full of things that can burn. Once you begin looking for fire, you see it everywhere. Not dramatic fire, not disaster, ordinary fire. A candle burns beside a clerk's papers. A coal fire glows behind a grate. A servant carries fuel along a corridor. A kitchen hearth radiates heat into stone walls. A lamp throws yellow light over a staircase. Each flame is small enough to ignore. Together, they form the hidden energy system of the palace. Westminster cannot function without them. Before electric lighting and modern central heating, flame is woven into daily life. Rooms need warmth through cold months. Corridors need light after sunset. Kitchens need heat for food. Offices need candles when the London sky grows dim. The palace is therefore constantly balancing usefulness against danger. You walk slowly through a passage and notice timber where you had previously noticed only walls. Wooden partitions divide rooms. Floors contain timber. Roof structures depend on vast amounts of seasoned wood. Doors, cupboards, shelves, desks, benches, document chests, and furniture add still more. Then there is paper, endless paper, bills, petitions, court records, correspondence, accounts, copies, reports. Parliament seems determined to surround every source of flame with material specifically designed to encourage it. Very efficient. You pass an office where candles stand close to stacks of documents. Nobody looks worried. Why would they? This arrangement is normal. A clerk reaches across the desk, moves a candle slightly, and returns to reading. That tiny movement may be the entire fire prevention system for the afternoon. The danger is not that people know nothing about fire. They know a great deal. London has experienced catastrophic fires before. Regulations, watchfulness, chimney maintenance, and practical habits all reflect long familiarity with the threat. But familiarity creates its own weakness. When a hazard becomes part of everyday life, people stop seeing it as exceptional. A coal basket beside a fireplace is simply a coal basket. A candle near curtains is simply lighting. A hot flue behind an old wall is simply part of the building, until it is not. The palace has another problem. Its architecture is complicated enough that heat, smoke, and sparks do not always behave in obvious ways. Remember those corridors added around older rooms, the blocked doorways, the converted chambers, the partitions inserted wherever more space was required. All of that creates voids and hidden routes. A fire can begin in one place and travel somewhere nobody is immediately watching. You enter a narrow passage and look upward. Behind the visible ceiling may be timber, dust, old construction material, and cavities produced by generations of alteration. You cannot inspect most of it, neither can the average clerk. The palace feels solid because so much stone surrounds you, but stone can conceal combustible structures. That illusion of solidity is dangerous. A curious detail from Old Westminster concerns the patchwork of heating arrangements. Over time, pipes, stoves, fireplaces, and flues were introduced or modified to serve rooms never originally intended for them. Imagine fitting newer heating technology into a medieval complex. The result is not exactly elegant. A pipe goes where it can. A flue bends around older masonry. A wall is opened. Another is closed. Someone declares the problem solved. Then decades pass. The person who understood the alteration dies. The building keeps the secret. You continue toward a room where a fire burns more strongly. The chimney draws upward. Warm air rises. Soot collects. Chimneys themselves require maintenance because accumulated deposits can ignite. A chimney fire is hardly unknown in 19th century London. Most are contained. Some are not. You smell faint soot as a servant adjusts the grate. Again, nothing is wrong. That is what makes the scene unsettling. Danger looks ordinary. The Palace of Westminster had already suffered fires before 1834. The blaze of 1512 had severely damaged the royal residential portions of the complex and helped shift monarchs away from Westminster as their principal London home. So the building carries a historical warning inside its own walls. Yet institutions are excellent at remembering ceremonies and surprisingly poor at remembering vulnerabilities. You move toward administrative rooms. More paper, more shelves, more candles. Some records are stored carefully. Others accumulate because government produces documents faster than anyone can develop perfect storage. The quantity is remarkable. Paper represents authority here. A signed document can order payment. A record can prove ownership. A parliamentary journal preserves decisions. An account may determine whether money is owed. Destroy the paper, and you may destroy evidence. This makes archives precious. It also makes them fuel. You imagine a spark landing in one of these stacks. At first, perhaps only a corner darkens. Then a small flame curls upward. Someone notices. A hand extinguishes it. Problem solved. That probably happens in many buildings without ever becoming history. But what if nobody is there? What if the flame begins behind a wall? What if heat builds beneath a floor? What if smoke travels somewhere unexpected? Those questions hover quietly around Westminster. Contemporary plans and later investigations reveal enough to show how awkwardly the old palace handled heating and ventilation. Yet specialists have never been able to reconstruct every concealed route and alteration with certainty. Too much changed over time. And the fire that would eventually destroy much of the complex also destroyed evidence that might have explained precisely how some spaces connected. The building will erase part of its own forensic record. For now, however, you can still walk through it. You reach a storage space. Old materials gather here: wood, boxes, documents, perhaps obsolete items no longer useful but not yet discarded. Government institutions accumulate objects almost as naturally as they accumulate forms. Someone always thinks a thing may be needed later. Often. Nobody is sure who has authority to throw it away. So it remains. Years pass, then decades. One particularly strange example of bureaucratic survival involves wooden tally sticks used by the exchequer. You do not examine them closely yet. That comes soon. For centuries. Notched wooden sticks helped record financial transactions by the 19th century. This ancient accounting system has become obsolete, yet quantities of the old tallies still exist. Little pieces of administrative history. Dry wooden pieces of administrative history. You might already see the problem. But the palace does not. Not yet. You leave the storage area and return to the corridor. A servant extinguishes one candle and lights another. The flame passes from wick to wick. Simple, controlled, routine. Your footsteps echo through the old building as midnight approaches behind doors. Fires slowly die down. Elsewhere. Embers remain hot. Chimneys retain heat. Paper rests on wooden shelves. Timber waits behind plaster and stone. The palace is quieting. But it is never completely cold. You realize that its greatest vulnerability is not a single reckless person. It is accumulation, centuries of alterations, thousands of combustible objects. heating systems layered into old architecture, routine confidence, and the assumption that tomorrow will look very much like today, soon. One of Westminster's most harmless-looking relics will be selected for disposal, a collection of old wooden sticks, worthless, outdated, almost comical, and someone will decide that the easiest way to get rid of them is simply to burn them. The wooden sticks do not look dangerous. That is the first thing you notice. No sparks, no smoke, no dramatic warning. Just dry lengths of wood, some split, some notched, some marked by a system that once helped the government keep track of money. You pick one up in imagination and turn it between your fingers. It feels almost absurdly primitive for a nation that now debates railways, industrial growth, global trade, and political reform. Yet these tally sticks belong to a financial tradition stretching back centuries, long before modern ledgers became dominant. The Exchequer recorded debts and payments by cutting notches into pieces of wood. Different notch sizes represented different sums. The stick was then split lengthwise so that two matching halves were created. One part could remain with the Exchequer, the other went to the person involved in the transaction. Later, the halves could be fitted together if the grain and notches matched. The record was difficult to forge, simple, physical, effective, almost charming, and now completely obsolete by the early 19th century. These sticks have become administrative leftovers from a vanished accounting world, but governments are rarely efficient at throwing away their own history. So the tallies remain, stored, moved, ignored, accumulated. Some have sat around for decades. Others represent records whose practical usefulness ended long before the people currently walking Westminster's corridors were born. You imagine a clerk discovering another bundle. He does not gasp with historical wonder. He probably sighs. To him, these are not priceless artifacts. They are clutter. That difference in perspective is important. Objects only become precious when someone decides they are. Until then, they occupy shelves. The old tally system itself had survived astonishingly late, even after more sophisticated financial accounting methods were available. Established administrative habits continued because replacing a system tied to law, office, and precedent could be awkward. Westminster loves continuity, sometimes far beyond the point where continuity becomes sensible. The formal use of tallies was finally abolished in the 19th century, leaving the government with large quantities of obsolete wooden records. Now comes the practical question. What do you do with them? Store them forever? Sell them? Discard them? Turn them into an educational display for future visitors who might find medieval accounting unexpectedly fascinating? That last option would be lovely. It is not the option chosen. Instead, someone decides they can be burned. You move through the palace toward the area where this disposal is being considered. The idea itself would not seem outrageous to the people involved. Wood is fuel. The sticks are useless. The palace has furnaces. Burning them solves the storage problem and perhaps saves a little ordinary fuel. Very tidy, very economical, very unfortunate. There is an almost comic mismatch between the dullness of the decision and what it will eventually produce. No conspirator whispers in a dark room. No enemy sneaks into the palace carrying a torch. No revolutionary plot is unfolding beneath the floorboards. A bureaucratic housekeeping problem is being solved. That is all. You can almost hear the conversation. What are we doing with these old tallies? Burn them. Where in the furnaces? Good. Next matter. History occasionally arrives wearing a uniform. Sometimes it arrives as an administrative shortcut. The furnaces chosen for the job are connected with a heating system beneath parts of the palace, including the House of Lords area. They are not designed as industrial incinerators capable of swallowing large amounts of dry wood rapidly and safely. They are heating furnaces. That distinction will matter. A worker can feed fuel into a fire and judge the result by what he sees directly, but heat also travels through metal, through brick, through flues, into surrounding materials. And old Westminster contains more surrounding material than anyone fully understands. You descend toward lower service spaces, the atmosphere becomes warmer. Brickwork surrounds the furnace areas, iron doors open and close. Workers tend the fires as part of practical building maintenance. Nothing here feels politically important. That may be why the risk is so easy to underestimate. The people responsible for burning the tallies are not attempting to damage anything. They are carrying out instructions. Later investigations would focus closely on exactly how the burning was managed, how fiercely the fires were allowed to develop, and how heat travelled through the structure. Even eyewitness recollections do not produce a perfectly simple sequence. Some accounts emphasize overloading. Others focus on the condition of the flues and surrounding construction. The disaster will eventually be explained not by one magical spark, but by several physical conditions aligning badly. For now, you simply watch dry sticks disappear into heat. A furnace door opens. Orange light spills across the floor. Several tally sticks are fed inside. The door closes. That could have been the end of them. Quietly. Safely. Nobody upstairs would know. But there are many more. Bundles. More. A vast administrative past has to be converted into ash. The work continues. One strange irony is hidden in the material itself. These sticks were created because wood was durable enough to preserve financial information. The notches survived handling. The split grain authenticated records. Centuries later. The same material is troublesome because it remains physically present. Its original strength has become bureaucratic inconvenience, and its dryness now makes it excellent fuel. You almost feel sorry for the sticks. They served the state once by refusing to disappear. They will serve it one last time by burning too well. You leave the furnace area and return upstairs. The palace seems unchanged. Clerks work, members talk, servants carry meals, lawyers pass through Westminster Hall. A woman waits with a petition. A doorkeeper recognizes another familiar face. Everything you have seen during your journey continues. The building has no idea that obsolete accounting tools are becoming part of its future legend. Perhaps buildings never know their final ordinary days. People certainly do not. That is what makes them ordinary. Someone complains about paperwork. Someone delays answering a letter. Someone decides to return tomorrow. Someone leaves a coat in an office. Someone plans dinner. A clerk expects to finish a task later in the week. The future feels available. You look back toward the lower levels. The tally sticks are still waiting. Not all of them will be burned at once. The disposal requires time. Workers will keep feeding them into the furnaces. Heat will build. And because the task seems so mundane, the palace will continue around it with almost no sense of drama. The exact responsibility for what follows would later become a matter of scrutiny, accusation, and technical investigation. Questions would be asked about supervision, furnace design, the amount of wood burned, and whether warnings were missed. But those questions belong to hindsight. Right now, nobody is standing here saying, "This is the moment." There is only a job, a pile of wood, a furnace, and a very old palace. You walk away as another bundle is carried toward the fire. Tomorrow, Westminster will wake again, for most people inside it. October 16th, 1834 will begin as another working day. The river will move, the courts will open, the chambers will fill, dinner will be prepared, and beneath all that ordinary activity, heat will quietly begin writing a different ending. October 16th of 1834 begins without drama. That is what makes the day feel so strange from where you stand now. You already know what is coming. The people around you do not. Morning reaches Westminster beneath a pale autumn sky. The Thames moves steadily beside the palace. Boats pass. Hooves strike the streets. Smoke rises from chimneys and merges with the usual London haze. Inside, doors open, clerks arrive. Servants begin carrying water, coal, food, and papers. The old building wakes exactly as it has done so many times before. You enter through familiar passages and notice how quickly routine hides danger. Nothing appears wrong. A clerk removes his coat and arranges documents on a desk. A messenger receives instructions. A lawyer crosses Westminster Hall with papers tucked beneath one arm. Somewhere, breakfast is being prepared. Somewhere else, someone is already complaining about a delay. The palace feels ordinary enough to be immortal. It is not. You walk toward the lower service areas where the tally sticks are being destroyed. The task has continued. Bundles of obsolete wooden records are fed into furnaces designed to warm parts of the building. The men performing the work do not treat the sticks ceremonially. Why would they? They are rubbish now. Old financial instruments that no longer have practical value. Their notches once represented money, debts, obligations, and transactions. Today they are fuel. The furnace doors open. Dry wood disappears inside. Heat rolls outward. The doors close again. The process continues. There are later claims that the workers are warned not to allow the fires to become too fierce. That instruction, if given exactly as later remembered, sounds sensible. But sensible instructions are only useful when everyone understands what too fierce means inside an old heating system. You cannot simply look at the visible flame and know what is happening farther along a flue. Heat may be travelling beyond the furnace chamber. Brickwork can become intensely hot. Nearby timber can dry further. Hidden structural spaces can begin warming long before smoke appears where anyone notices it. Upstairs, none of this seems relevant. Parliamentary business proceeds. The House of Lords is not sitting in ordinary session that day, but the palace remains active with officials, staff, residents, visitors, and workers. Documents still need handling. Rooms still need servicing. Government does not close because someone is burning old bookkeeping equipment downstairs. You follow a servant carrying a tray. He knows nothing about furnace temperatures. His problem is getting food to the right room while it remains warm. That is the scale of concern most people occupy. Small, immediate, human. The tray reaches its destination. A door closes. Life continues in another room. A clerk writes a letter dated October 16th. He has no reason to consider the date remarkable. You imagine the pen crossing the paper. 16th October 1834. Ordinary ink. Ordinary handwriting. Within hours. That date will become inseparable from destruction. But the clerk cannot feel history approaching. Neither can you. If you force yourself to forget what you know, that is one of the most difficult things to understand about catastrophe. Before it happens, the world is not filled with warning music. It contains errands, tea, unfinished sentences, people wondering what time they can leave. You cross Westminster Hall. Its great hammer beam roof rises above the usual movement. Lawyers and officials pass beneath it. The hall has survived fires, political upheavals, trials, ceremonies, and centuries of rebuilding. It looks permanent. If you had to choose which part of the palace would survive the coming night, perhaps you would not trust such an enormous medieval timber roof. Yet history enjoys contradicting appearances. The hall will prove astonishingly resilient. Elsewhere, newer and more altered structures will fail. By afternoon, the tally burning has produced substantial heat. Accounts later given to investigators describe fires intense enough to raise concern. Workmen and officials would disagree over details, including what instructions were given and how the furnaces were managed. The testimony is messy. Memory after disaster usually is. People protect themselves, people misremember, people emphasize what they noticed and omit what they did not. Later committees would try to turn these fragments into a clean chain of responsibility. The building itself offers only partial answers. You descend again. The furnace chamber feels unpleasantly hot. The tally sticks burn rapidly. Dry wood produces flame much faster than the coal these heating systems normally consume. That difference is easy to underestimate. Coal burns differently. Wood can flare. A furnace built around one pattern of fuel may react badly when stuffed with another. You stand near the brickwork and imagine heat moving through it. No visible flames emerge into the rooms above. No alarm rings. No one runs. Yet something is changing. The heat reaches flues beneath or beside parts of the Lord's complex. Timbers near the system begin to warm. Perhaps they have been exposed to elevated temperatures before. Perhaps repeated heating has already reduced their tolerance. Exactly how long that process had been developing is difficult to establish with certainty, because the subsequent destruction erased much of the physical evidence. What survives is enough to show that the danger was not merely the flame inside the furnace. It was what the furnace could heat beyond itself. You return upstairs. Late afternoon light enters through windows at a lower angle. The palace begins preparing for evening. Candles will soon be needed. How many times have you seen that routine now? A servant lights one. Another wick catches. A lamp glows. Fire appears in dozens of rooms at precisely the moment hidden heat may already be building elsewhere. No one connects them. Why would they? A faint smell may appear. Warm wood, smoke, something slightly unusual. Old buildings constantly smell slightly unusual. Chimneys smoke, kitchens roast food, coal fires produce soot. A strange odour is not automatically an emergency. That is the problem. One person later recalled noticing unusual heat earlier in the day around areas connected with the furnace system. Another account suggests signs were present before anyone understood their significance. Whether those warnings could realistically have prevented the disaster remains uncertain. It is easy for you to stand here with hindsight and shout at people who cannot hear you. Check the flues, stop the furnaces, open the walls, call for help, but to them, this is still Thursday. You walk through the Lord's area. An attendant adjusts something near a doorway. A clerk passes. A woman connected with one of the residential apartments moves through another corridor. Remember those households hidden within the palace. They matter now. This is not an empty government shell waiting to burn after everyone goes home. People are still inside. Possessions remain in rooms, furniture, letters, clothing, books, objects collected over years. The palace contains private lives as well as public records as evening approaches. The temperature begins to fall outside. People naturally feed ordinary fires. The irony is almost cruel. A colder evening encourages more heat precisely when the building needs less. The river darkens. Clouds reflect the fading light. Across London, lamps begin appearing one by one. You reach New Palace Yard. For a moment, the exterior seems peaceful. The irregular roofs stand against the evening sky. Chimneys release smoke. Westminster Hall remains enormous and calm. There is no visible inferno, not yet. A person passing on the street would have no reason to stop. The palace has looked old and smoky for generations. You turn back inside. The first unmistakable signs are close now. Heat has found material it should never have reached, somewhere beyond ordinary sight. Timber begins to char. At first there may be little flame. Wood darkens, resins alter, smoke gathers. Then oxygen reaches the right place. A glow strengthens. The process accelerates. The palace is still talking, still working, still carrying plates, still moving documents, and hidden within its walls. Part of Westminster has begun burning before Westminster realises it is on fire. You pause in a passage. There. A smell. Stronger now. Not kitchen smoke. Not an ordinary grate. Someone else notices it too. A head turns, footsteps stop. For several seconds, nobody knows what they're smelling. Then a servant moves toward the source. A door opens. Someone calls out. The routine of the day fractures, and outside, along the darkening Thames, London is about to receive one of the most spectacular sights of the century. The first alarm does not sound like history. It sounds like confusion. A voice calls from farther down the passage. Another answers. Someone runs. The smell of smoke thickens until it is impossible to explain away as a kitchen fire or an overworked chimney. Then you see it, a glow where no glow should be. Orange light flickers behind part of the structure near the House of Lords. For a few seconds, everyone seems to be waiting for someone else to understand what is happening. Then the palace erupts into movement. Doors open. Servants rush into corridors. Officials shout instructions. People begin carrying whatever they can. Water, documents, personal belongings. Anything that appears valuable enough to save and light enough to move. The hidden fire has already gained an advantage. It is burning inside an old building filled with concealed timber, partitions, roof spaces, furniture, paper, and pathways that allow heat and flame to travel faster than the people chasing them. You follow several men toward the Lord's area. Smoke rolls overhead. It stings your eyes almost immediately. The quiet administrative world you have spent the day exploring has transformed. Clerks who carefully carried papers are now grabbing bundles by the armful. Servants who spent hours tending harmless fires are suddenly fighting one that refuses to remain harmless. The irony hardly needs explaining. You hear wood crack. The sound is sharp. Then another. Flame appears higher in the structure. Once it reaches roof timbers, the scale changes. Fire that had been hidden begins to announce itself to London. Outside, people notice smoke pouring above Westminster. At first, passers-by stop. Then more stop. News spreads. A fire at Parliament. People begin moving toward the palace. Of course they do. Human beings have never required social media to gather around something spectacular. By evening, crowds are converging on Westminster from surrounding streets while boats gather on the Thames. The river offers one of the clearest views. You step outside and turn toward the palace. For a moment, the scene is almost impossible to comprehend. Flames rise above roofs that had seemed permanent only hours earlier. Windows glow. Smoke twists upward into the darkening sky. The river reflects orange light in long, trembling streaks. Boats crowd the water. Spectators line bridges and embankments. London watches its Parliament burn. The fire brigade responds, but firefighting in 1834 is nothing like the coordinated municipal service you might expect today. London still relies on a patchwork of parish engines, private fire brigades associated with insurance companies, military assistants, and other organised responders. Engines arrive, hoses are deployed, water is pumped, men struggle through smoke, crowds, narrow approaches, and the confusing architecture you already know too well. Remember those inconvenient passages. Now imagine carrying equipment through them while parts of the building are burning. The palace's complexity, mildly amusing this morning, has become dangerous. The flames spread rapidly through sections around the House of Lords. The Commons is threatened. Roofs catch. Timbers burn. Interior spaces collapse. The sound rolls across the river. Crashing wood, breaking glass, shouting, water pumps, the roar of flame. And beneath it, the endless murmur of thousands of spectators. Among those watching is the painter J. M. W. Turner. who would later create dramatic images of the fire from viewpoints around the Thames. Another artist, John Constable, also observed the event. That gives the disaster an unusual afterlife. The destruction of Westminster becomes not only political history, but visual spectacle, preserved in glowing paintings where fire seems almost to consume the night itself. You can understand why artists cannot look away. The scene is terrible. It is also astonishing. Flames illuminate towers and walls from below. Smoke turns red. Reflections shiver across black water. For anyone who has spent years seeing the palace as old, awkward, permanent, and slightly shabby, watching it disappear in hours must feel unreal. The House of Commons chamber in St. Stephen's Chapel is engulfed. The cramped room where members argued shoulder to shoulder is lost. The House of Lords burns. Offices vanish. Passages collapse. Rooms that carried centuries of institutional memory become shells. People save what they can. Important records are removed from some areas. Other documents are lost. Furniture is carried outside. Personal belongings from apartments are rescued in haste. There is no graceful evacuation. History comes out in bundles. You see papers clutched against coats, boxes dragged across stones, objects placed wherever space can be found. Some items are probably saved because someone happens to be standing nearby. Others disappear because nobody reaches them in time. That randomness is unavoidable. Fire does not understand archival importance. Now your attention turns toward Westminster Hall. The ancient hall stands dangerously close to the destruction. Its roof is timber, enormous timber. You remember looking up at those medieval hammer beams this morning and wondering how anything so old could still stand. Now flames are approaching. The survival of the hall becomes one of the central dramas of the night. Firefighters and others work to prevent the blaze from taking hold there. Water is directed toward vulnerable areas. Nearby structures are sacrificed or allowed to burn, while effort concentrates on protecting what can still be saved. At one point, the hall appears to be in serious danger. Imagine losing it. The room completed in 1099. The roof shaped in Richard II's reign. Centuries of coronation banquets, courts, state trials, legal argument, and ordinary footsteps. All of it seems capable of vanishing before morning, but the hall holds. Its great roof survives. The stone walls survive. The oldest monumental space within the complex remains standing, while much of the later palace around it is destroyed. There is something almost unfair about that. The structure most obviously associated with the Middle Ages proves tougher than many of the additions wrapped around it. You could call it luck. Design matters too. So does determined firefighting. Later accounts would disagree over which interventions were most decisive, and memory naturally magnified certain individual acts. Yet the larger outcome is unmistakable. Westminster Hall survives the night. Much of the old palace does not. You stand beside the Thames as the hours pass. The crowds remain. Some people cheer when structures collapse, treating the destruction as spectacle or even as symbolic judgment on Parliament. Others watch in horror. Political attitudes shape reactions. For reformers who regard the old parliamentary system as corrupt or archaic, there is an obvious temptation to see symbolism in the flames. For those attached to the institution and its history, the sight is devastating. But fire does not choose sides. It consumes Whig wood and Tory wood with admirable impartiality. By late night, large portions of the complex are ruins. The flames begin losing their greatest intensity. Smoke still pours upward. Glowing embers remain. Walls stand without roofs. Windows are black openings. Water runs through debris. The palace you entered before dawn no longer exists in the form you knew. Those confusing corridors are gone. The cramped Commons chamber is gone. Many offices are gone. Rooms built, altered, patched, divided, and reused through generations have disappeared in a single night. Yet the institution survives. Parliament will meet again. Temporary arrangements will be made. Architects will debate what should replace the ruins. Eventually, Charles Barry and Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin will help create the vast Gothic revival complex that future generations associate so completely with Westminster that many will forget how different its predecessor looked. That future building will rise from disaster. But you remain here in 1834. The night is quieter now. You walk once more toward Westminster Hall. Smoke drifts across the yard. Your shoes crunch on debris. The ancient walls are wet from firefighting. The roof above is dark, still there. You stand beneath it. This morning the hall was crowded with lawyers, petitioners, clerks, and messengers. Now it is almost silent. The space echoes faintly. Water drips somewhere in the darkness. And you realize that the hidden life of old Westminster has ended. Not every tradition, not Parliament itself, but the physical world that shaped generations of politicians, servants, lawyers, women, clerks, messengers, cooks, doorkeepers, and residents has been broken open by fire. Tomorrow, people will begin counting losses. Tonight, the palace simply smoulders. The crowds gradually thin along the river. Boats turn away one by one, their oars dipping softly into water that still reflects the last red glow from the ruins. You remain beneath the surviving roof of Westminster Hall for a little longer. The air is cooler now. Smoke fades into the darkness. The shouting has become distant. Somewhere beyond the palace, London continues sleeping, unaware or only half aware that one of its most familiar landmarks has changed forever. You think back through the day, the damp morning passages, the lawyers beneath this roof, the cramped commons benches, the solemn lords, the clerks bending over their papers, the servants carrying coal, the women waiting at the edges of political space, the late-night candles, and those ridiculous little tally sticks, once created to remember money and eventually remembered for helping destroy a palace. All of it feels farther away now. The fire has turned ordinary rooms into history. But you do not need to follow the rebuilding tonight. You do not need to think about architects, committees, elections, or the new towers that will someday rise beside the Thames, for now. Westminster Hall is enough. The old beams rest quietly overhead. The river continues past the walls as it has for centuries. Cool night air moves through the darkness. The embers dim, voices fade, footsteps disappear, and the palace, after one final terrible night of light and noise, becomes still, so you can leave it here. Let the river carry the last reflections away. Let the smoke dissolve into the sleeping city. And as the surviving stones settle into silence, allow your own thoughts to soften with them, slower and quieter now, until there is nothing left to follow except the gentle movement of dark water beneath the London night. Sweet dreams.